The morning started like any other on my ranch, quiet and calm, with the kind of stillness that only comes from living miles away from the nearest town. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, and I could hear the low, familiar grumble of my bulls in the pen behind the barn. I'd been up since dawn, as usual, finishing the feeding, checking the fences, and walking the perimeter to make sure everything was in order. Owning this land had been a dream of mine since I was a kid, and now that it was mine, I treated it like a sacred space. Every tree, every patch of grass, every fence post had meaning. The last thing I ever expected was for someone to waltz in and treat it like their personal campground. But I suppose I should have expected it from Karen, the president of the HOA that I'd been butting heads with for months. She was the kind of woman who didn't just think the rules applied to everyone else, she thought she made the rules. And for some reason, she thought those rules extended past the HOA boundary and onto my private ranch. It started a few weeks earlier when she came strutting up my driveway with that clipboard she never seemed to put down. She was wearing her usual bright pink tracksuit and big sunglasses even though it was cloudy. She told me there was a community event planned, and they might need to use some of my property because it had the best open space. I laughed right in her face and told her there was no way I was letting an HOA event happen on my land. My ranch wasn't part of their development. I wasn't under their jurisdiction, and I had worked hard to keep it that way. She didn't like my answer. I could tell because she pursed her lips, made a note on her clipboard, and stomped off without another word. That should have been the end of it, but I had a bad feeling it wasn't. I knew Karen, and Karen didn't like being told no. Over the next few days, I noticed more and more activity near the edge of my property. People from the HOA were coming by, measuring things, taking photos, and acting like they owned the place. I confronted a few of them and told them to get lost, and they always said they were just scouting locations. I warned them that if anyone set foot past my fence line, they'd be trespassing. They nodded like they understood, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't take me seriously. Most people don't until they learn the hard way. The thing about living out here is that it's not like the suburbs. There aren't streetlights or sidewalks. There aren't friendly neighbors to wave at. Out here, if you cross onto someone's property uninvited, you're on your own. The night before everything went down, I was sitting on my porch with a glass of whiskey, listening to the cicadas, when I heard a strange noise in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a truck backfiring, but then I heard music, loud music, carried on the wind. I set down my glass, grabbed my flashlight, and headed down the dirt road toward the sound. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It wasn't just one truck. It was dozens of cars, trucks, and RVs pulling into a makeshift parking area just outside my fence line. I could see headlights sweeping across the fields, and the sound of people laughing and shouting filled the night. When I got closer, I nearly lost my temper. They had set up tents, grills, tables, and even a stage, all lined up like some kind of outdoor festival. And there, in the middle of it all, was Karen with a megaphone, barking orders like she was the queen of the world. I didn't walk up quietly. I marched right into the middle of their setup and yelled for everyone to stop what they were doing. Most of them turned and looked at me like I was crazy, like I was interrupting their fun. Karen didn't even flinch. She put the megaphone down, smiled that fake smile of hers, and said they were holding a community campout to celebrate the end of summer. She said it was going to be great for morale and bring everyone together. I told her I didn't care what it was for, this was my property, and everyone needed to leave immediately. She crossed her arms, smirked, and said they had permission from the HOA to be there. I told her the HOA had no power here and she was trespassing. She waved her hand dismissively and said they'd be gone by morning. By then, I could feel my blood pressure rising. I told her that if they didn't clear out, I was going to call the sheriff. She rolled her eyes and said I was overreacting. That was the last straw for me. I turned on my heel and walked back to my house, already planning my next move. Calling the sheriff might have been the normal thing to do, but I knew how slow response times could be out here, and by the time they showed up, these people could have trashed my entire property. I needed a solution that would work fast and make sure they never tried this again. And as I sat back on my porch, staring out at the dark shapes of my bulls grazing in the pasture, the solution came to me. My bulls were some of the most well-trained animals you'd ever meet, but they were big, loud, and intimidating. Most people from the suburbs had never been within 50 feet of one, let alone a whole herd. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. If they wanted to treat my land like a campground, maybe I should introduce them to the real residents. I went to bed with that thought in mind and woke up before dawn, ready to put my plan into action. The sky was still dark when I rolled out of bed the next morning, but I didn't waste a second. I threw on my boots, grabbed my hat, and headed straight for the barn. My bulls were already awake, snorting and stomping, sensing that something was different about the morning. They were massive creatures, over 1,000 pounds each, with thick, muscular necks and horns that could send a grown man running. I raised them from calves, and they knew me as their handler, which made them calm around me, but to strangers, they were nothing short of terrifying. I loaded up a bucket of feed and rattled it against the gate to get their attention. They followed me as I walked them toward the large pasture near the fence line, the one that just happened to run along the area where Karen and her crew had camped out. The sun had barely begun to rise when I heard voices and music again. They had been partying all night, and a few of them were already up, starting campfires and cooking breakfast like they owned the place. I stood there at the fence line for a minute, watching them, taking in the sheer disrespect of it all. Trash was already scattered across my grass, beer cans lying in the dirt, and tire tracks cutting deep into the soil I had worked hard to keep healthy. It was worse than I thought. They hadn't just camped out, they had turned my property into a festival ground. The sight made my jaw clench so hard I could feel my teeth ache. Karen was standing near one of the tables, holding a coffee mug and laughing with a group of women. She looked like she hadn't slept a wink, but she was still giving orders like some kind of general. The nerve of that woman was unbelievable. I tightened my grip on the feed bucket and started opening the gate. One by one, my bulls came out, snorting and tossing their heads as they made their way toward the pasture. Their hooves thudded against the ground like distant drumbeats, and even though they were still calm, the sound alone made a few of the campers stop what they were doing and look over. At first, nobody seemed too worried. They probably thought they were just big cows. But I knew what was about to happen. I walked along behind the herd, making sure they stayed together, guiding them toward the far side of the pasture where the campers were set up. The closer we got, the more the mood on the other side of the fence started to change. People backed up, stepping away from their tents, pointing, whispering. Then one of the bulls let out a loud, guttural bellow that echoed across the field. That sound was enough to make the first wave of panic set in. I stopped near the fence and watched. The bulls started to trot, not aggressively, but with enough speed to kick up dust and send a clear message that they weren't just wandering around. The campers started to scatter, grabbing their kids, their folding chairs, and anything they could carry. Karen tried to act calm at first, waving her hands and telling everyone it was fine, but even she looked nervous when the biggest bull lowered his head and pawed at the dirt. The sight of that huge animal with its head down was enough to send the whole group running for their cars. Some of them tripped over their own gear in their rush to get out. Coolers were overturned, tents were ripped down in seconds, and I saw one guy abandon a whole grill because he didn't have time to pack it. People were screaming, kids were crying, and the noise level went from loud music to total chaos in less than a minute. My bulls didn't chase them, they didn't have to. Just being there, snorting and stomping, was enough to clear the place faster than anything I could have done on my own. Karen was the last one to move. She stood there frozen, clutching her clipboard like it was going to protect her. I leaned against the fence and just watched her, letting her know with my silence that this was her doing. When the second bull bellowed, she finally snapped out of it, dropped the clipboard, and ran for her SUV. I've never seen someone move that fast in my life. By the time she slammed her door shut, half the campers were already driving away in a line of cars that kicked up a dust storm down the road. Within minutes, the entire field was empty except for the mess they had left behind. Broken chairs, empty bottles, food wrappers. It looked like a tornado had come through. I took a deep breath, looked at my bulls, and felt a wave of satisfaction. The plan had worked. Nobody had gotten hurt, and I doubted any of them would be brave enough to try something like this again. I let the bulls graze for a while as I surveyed the damage. It was going to take me hours to clean up the mess, but I didn't mind. The important thing was that they were gone. Eventually, I rounded up the bulls and led them back to the barn, giving each of them a pat on the flank like they were part of my cleanup crew. I could still hear the sound of engines in the distance as the last of the campers fled, and it made me smile. Later that afternoon, when things had calmed down, I got a knock on my door. It was one of the sheriff's deputies. Apparently, Karen had called the cops to complain that I had threatened her guests with dangerous animals. I invited the deputy in, offered him some coffee, and explained the situation from start to finish. He chuckled, shook his head, and said there was nothing illegal about letting my bulls graze on my own land. He even said he wished he could have seen the look on Karen's face. That was enough to make me laugh out loud. When the deputy left, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Karen had tried to humiliate me, but she ended up humiliating herself instead. And now, every time I look out at that pasture, I think about how fast they all ran, screaming and tripping over each other. It's a memory I'll probably carry with me for the rest of my life. The next few days after the bull stampede, as the neighbors started calling it, were some of the quietest I'd experienced in a while. Not a single car came down my road, not a single drone from the HOA hovered overhead, and even Karen's usual chain of emails and letters stopped. I almost thought I had finally won. I spent my mornings working the ranch, repairing the deep tire tracks their cars had left in my soil, and stacking up the abandoned junk I had collected from the campsite. The place had been trashed so badly it took me nearly 3 days to haul off everything to the dump. I didn't mind the work, though. Manual labor always cleared my head, and there was something deeply satisfying about reclaiming my land from the chaos they had brought. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to take a public humiliation like that lying down. I should have known it was only a matter of time before she came back swinging. The first sign came in the form of a letter that showed up in my mailbox, printed on HOA letterhead. It wasn't addressed to me by name, just to the property owner. Inside, it said that the HOA had held an emergency meeting and had voted to issue me a fine of $10,000 for creating a dangerous situation that endangered community members. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the letter. My land wasn't part of their HOA. Their rules didn't apply to me, and they knew it. This was nothing but a scare tactic. I crumpled it up, tossed it in the trash, and didn't think much more about it, at least, not until the second letter arrived a few days later. This one was nastier. It accused me of harassment, threats of violence, and reckless endangerment. It said the HOA was considering taking me to civil court to recover damages on behalf of the campers. Now I wasn't laughing. Not because I was scared, I knew they didn't have a legal leg to stand on, but because I could see what Karen was doing. She was trying to ruin my reputation. Out here, where everyone knows everyone, that can be just as damaging as an actual lawsuit. I had already heard whispers at the feed store when I went into town. People asking if it was true that I'd set loose a herd of bulls on innocent campers. People who had always been friendly to me suddenly kept their distance, waiting to see if I was the kind of man they should stay away from. Karen was spreading rumors, and they were starting to stick. That's when I decided I needed to take control of the narrative. I wasn't going to sit back and let her paint me as some unhinged lunatic who endangered children. I called up a few friends in town, people who knew me, people who had been to my ranch and seen firsthand how I cared for my animals, and invited them over for a barbecue. I made sure it was a casual, friendly event, nothing formal, just good food, good beer, and plenty of open space for them to see the bulls grazing peacefully. Word got around quickly, and by the end of the afternoon, half the town had stopped by. They saw with their own eyes that my bulls were calm, trained, and not the monsters Karen was making them out to be. It felt good to have that support, to have people telling me to my face that they were on my side. Karen must have heard about the barbecue because the next morning, she was back. This time she didn't come alone, she brought 2 men with her, both of them in suits, both of them carrying briefcases. I could tell right away they were lawyers. She strutted up to my porch like she owned the place, her sunglasses glinting in the sunlight, her lips curled into that smug little smile that made my blood boil. She handed me a manila envelope and said, in her syrupy sweet voice, that I had been officially served. I opened it right there on the porch and found a stack of papers. She was actually suing me. Trespassing, harassment, property damage, and a dozen other claims that were so ridiculous I almost laughed again. I didn't say a word to her. I just stared at her until she started to squirm, then I told her to leave my property before I called the sheriff. She hesitated for a moment, clearly expecting me to argue or try to negotiate, but when I didn't budge, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her car. I stood there watching her drive off, feeling a cold, focused anger settle over me. If she wanted a war, she was going to get one, but it was going to be on my terms. That evening, I sat down with a pot of coffee and went through every page of the lawsuit. Most of it was boilerplate nonsense, but I noticed a few glaring mistakes. She had listed the wrong parcel number for my property, misquoted the county statutes she was citing, and even claimed that her HOA bylaws gave them jurisdiction over land outside their subdivision, which was completely false. It was sloppy work, and it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. She wanted to intimidate me into giving her what she wanted. I called my cousin, who happened to be one of the best attorneys in the county, and sent him copies of the papers. He called me back an hour later, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. He said Karen's lawsuit didn't have a chance of holding up in court. He told me to sit tight and let him handle it, and that we'd not only get the suit dismissed but also file a countersuit for harassment and attempted fraud. That was music to my ears. The next week was tense. Karen kept driving by slowly in her SUV, glaring at my house like she was daring me to make a move. HOA board members started showing up at the edge of my property, taking pictures, trying to provoke me. I ignored them. I kept working the ranch, kept my bulls fed and calm, and waited for the court date. When the day finally came, I put on my best clean shirt and drove into town with my cousin. The hearing didn't last long. The judge looked at the paperwork, asked Karen a few pointed questions about why she thought her HOA had jurisdiction over land that wasn't part of their subdivision, and when she couldn't answer, he dismissed the case on the spot. But my cousin wasn't done. He immediately filed for a restraining order against the HOA, barring them from setting foot on my property again, and presented our countersuit for harassment and slander. The look on Karen's face was priceless. she went from smug to pale in seconds. Walking out of that courtroom felt like walking out of a storm into clear sunlight. I had won, legally and publicly, and everyone knew it. But as I drove back to the ranch, I knew this wasn't over. Karen had been embarrassed twice now, once by the bulls and once in court, and people like her didn't just back down. They came back meaner. I could feel it in my gut that she was already planning her next move, and this time, I'd be ready for her. I woke up the next morning with a sense of uneasy calm, like the air just before a thunderstorm. Winning in court had felt good, but something about the way Karen had glared at me on her way out of the courthouse told me she wasn't finished. People like her didn't just give up. They doubled down. Sure enough, 2 nights later, the trouble started again. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, when I heard my dogs barking like mad. They only bark like that when there's someone on the property. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding. The beam of light swept across the yard, and that's when I saw it. Someone had spray-painted my barn door with the words, "Animal Abuser," in big, red letters. My stomach turned hot with anger. I didn't see who did it, but I had a good guess. There were fresh tire tracks near the fence line that didn't belong to me, and I spotted footprints in the dirt leading toward the road. I took photos of everything, knowing this would be more ammo for my countersuit, but it wasn't just about the legal side of things anymore. This was personal now. They had stepped over a line. This wasn't just a legal battle or a neighborhood dispute, this was an attack on my home, my livelihood, and my peace. The next day, I started hearing rumors around town that Karen had been holding emergency meetings with the HOA and some of the more impressionable neighbors. She was telling anyone who would listen that I was dangerous, that my bulls were a public threat, that my ranch was a hazard. I heard she even went so far as to say I was stockpiling weapons and looking for a fight. That made me laugh, but it also made me realize how serious this was getting. Words like that can get the wrong kind of attention. I had to protect my land, my animals, and my reputation before she pushed things too far. I called my cousin again and showed him the photos of the vandalism. He said we'd add it to the harassment case and file a police report. But while the legal process was moving, I knew I couldn't just sit around and wait. So I doubled down on security. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the barn and the house, set up trail cameras along the fence line, and made sure my dogs were out patrolling every night. If Karen or her cronies came back, I'd have evidence, and this time, they wouldn't get away unseen. Sure enough, it didn't take long. A few nights later, just after midnight, my cameras caught a group of 3 people sneaking along the back fence. They had spray paint cans in their hands and were clearly up to no good. I didn't call the sheriff right away. I grabbed my spotlight, jumped on my ATV, and roared across the field. When I hit them with the light, they froze like deer in the headlights. One of them dropped the can and bolted, the other 2 stumbled after him, scrambling over the fence as fast as they could. I didn't chase them past the property line, but I made sure to get a good look at their faces. I recognized one of them immediately. He was Karen's nephew, a kid I'd seen mowing her lawn a few times. The next morning, I printed out still shots from the trail camera and took them straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy I'd spoken to before shook his head and said Karen was getting out of control. He promised to pay her a visit and warned her that if it happened again, she'd be facing criminal charges. That gave me some satisfaction, but I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't back down when threatened, they got more creative. For a few days, things were quiet again. I almost let myself think maybe the message had finally sunk in. Then came the sabotage. I woke up one morning to find one of my fences cut clean through, leaving a wide opening big enough for a truck to drive through. It didn't take long to see what had happened. someone had driven onto my land, tearing deep ruts into the soil, and dumped several bags of garbage and broken furniture right in the middle of the pasture. It looked deliberate, like they wanted to make a statement. My bulls were milling around nervously near the far side of the field, snorting and pawing at the dirt. Luckily, none of them had gotten loose, but if they had, it could have been a disaster. That was the last straw for me. I wasn't just going to defend my land anymore. I was going to take the fight right to Karen's front door, metaphorically, of course, but in a way that would leave no doubt who she was dealing with. I spent the next 2 days cleaning up the mess, repairing the fence, and preparing a little surprise. I took one of the old trailers I used for hauling feed and parked it near the fence line where the campers had been before. Then I hung a huge sign on it that said, in bold black letters, "Trespassers will be met with 1,500 pounds of bull." I added a motion-activated speaker that would play a loud bull bellow any time someone got within 20 feet of it. It worked like a charm. The first night I set it up, I heard the speaker go off 3 times. By the time I went out there, whoever had triggered it was long gone, but the cameras caught them running like their lives depended on it. The next day, I heard that Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting again, this time to discuss safety concerns about my ranch. That made me laugh out loud. She was the one trespassing, vandalizing, and harassing me, and now she was scared because of a sign and a sound effect? Good. That was the point. Things reached a boiling point a week later when Karen decided to host another community gathering, this time right outside my property line. They parked their cars along the road, set up folding chairs, and spent the entire afternoon glaring at my house like they were staging a protest. I sat on my porch the whole time, arms crossed, not saying a word. When the sun went down, I let my bulls out into the pasture closest to them. The sound of hooves hitting the dirt made the crowd scatter faster than I've ever seen. They left so quickly they forgot half their chairs. By now, even people in the HOA were starting to get tired of Karen's antics. I overheard some of them in town complaining about how much drama she had stirred up, how many fines she was trying to issue, and how much money she was wasting on legal fees. It was clear she was losing support, and that gave me an idea. I started documenting everything, every tire track, every bit of vandalism, every false claim she made. I put it all together in a binder and sent copies to every member of the HOA board. Within a week, I heard that they were holding a vote to remove her as president. I didn't go to the meeting, but I didn't have to. The next morning, I saw her driving by my property in her SUV, looking angrier than I'd ever seen her. She didn't stop, didn't roll down the window, didn't shout at me, just drove past with her jaw clenched. Later that day, I got a call from one of the board members telling me she had been voted out by a landslide. She was no longer HOA president, no longer had any power, and no longer had an excuse to meddle in my life. But I knew Karen. Losing the title wouldn't stop her. It would only make her more reckless. I could feel it coming, the last desperate move she'd make before this whole mess finally came to an end. And when she made it, I was going to be ready. The night after Karen lost her HOA presidency, the air felt electric, charged with tension. I knew she wouldn't go quietly, and sure enough, just after midnight, my dogs went wild. Their barking was frantic, the kind of sound that makes your gut clench because you know something is really wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, my boots, and my shotgun, not because I planned to use it, but because out here, you don't take chances when someone comes onto your property after dark. When I reached the pasture, the beam of my flashlight caught the glint of metal. Someone had cut the fence again, and this time they'd gone further, they had opened the gate to the bull pen. My heart stopped for a second before I saw that my bulls were still inside, milling nervously, but it was clear what the intruder's plan had been. They wanted to let the bulls loose, either to cause chaos or to make it look like I was careless and dangerous. Either way, the damage could have been catastrophic, not just to me, but to anyone on the road who might have encountered a 1,000-pound animal in the dark. I heard the crunch of footsteps and swung the flashlight toward the sound. There she was, Karen, standing near the gate with a pair of bolt cutters in her hand. She froze in the beam of the light, caught red-handed. For a moment, neither of us moved. The night was dead silent except for the sound of my bulls breathing heavily behind me. Then she dropped the cutters and bolted toward the road. I didn't chase her myself, I didn't have to. My trail cameras had caught the whole thing from 3 different angles, and by the time I got back to the house, I was already on the phone with the sheriff's department. They sent 2 deputies out, and I showed them the footage. They didn't hesitate. They knew this wasn't just vandalism anymore, this was reckless endangerment on a whole different level. They drove out to Karen's house that same night, and I heard later that they hauled her away in handcuffs. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Karen was formally charged with trespassing, destruction of property, and attempted criminal mischief. My cousin pushed hard on our countersuit, and with the video evidence, it was an easy win. The court ordered Karen to pay for every bit of damage she had caused, from the cut fences to the spray paint on the barn, and hit her with a restraining order that prohibited her from coming within 500 feet of my property. But the real justice came from the community. Word of what she had done spread fast, and people who had once supported her started turning on her. She couldn't show her face in town without someone whispering about her behind her back. The HOA board that had once backed her now treated her like a pariah. I heard she had to sell her house and move to a different neighborhood entirely because she couldn't stand the shame. As for me, life finally went back to normal. The fields healed, the fences were repaired, and my bulls went back to grazing peacefully under the wide Texas sky. I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and realized how much had changed since the whole mess started. I had gone from being a quiet man who just wanted to be left alone to someone who had stood up for himself, his land, and his peace, and won. I still keep the sign on the trailer that says, "Trespassers will be met with 1,500 pounds of bull." Not because I expect Karen, or anyone like her, to come back, but because it's a reminder of what I had to do to defend what was mine. It's a warning to anyone who thinks they can push me around. And every time I hear my bulls snorting in the distance, I can't help but smile, remembering the day they cleared 1,000 trespassers off my land without laying a single horn on anyone. In the end, Karen had tried everything, lawsuits, lies, vandalism, even sabotage, and none of it worked. What she didn't understand, what she never could have understood, was that this ranch isn't just land. It's my life. It's my history. It's the blood, sweat, and years I've put into building something worth protecting. And if anyone ever tries to take it from me again, well, let's just say I've still got a herd of bulls that are always ready to do what they do best.